Hey everybody, today is Pajama Day, so I'm here today reading your books, and I got my cozy warm Pioche Tigers hoodie on and my fuzzy socks, and we're ready to read some Dr. Seuss books for our Seuss Madness. Today our matchup is between the Lorax, a very well-known Seuss book, and the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, which is not as well known. So we're gonna read these two, and then you guys are going to vote, and we're going to figure out which one wins. Okay, let's get started with the Lorax. At the far end of town where the grickle grass grows, and the wind smells slow and sour when it blows, and no birds ever sing except for old crows, is the street of the lifted Lorax. And deep in the grickle grass, some people say, if you look deep enough, you can see still today where the Lorax once stood, just as long as it could, before somebody lifted the Lorax away. What was the Lorax, and why was it there? And why was it lifted and taken somewhere? From the far end of town where the grickle grass grows. The old Once-ler still lives here. Ask him, he still knows. You won't see the Once-ler. Don't knock at his door. He stays in his lurkin on top of his store. He lurks in his lurkin, cold under the roof, where he makes his own clothes out of myth-muffered moof. And on special dank midnights in August, he peeks out of the shutters, and sometimes he speaks, and tells how the Lorax was lifted away. He'll tell you, perhaps, if you're willing to pay. On the end of a rope, he lets down a tin pail, and you have to toss in 15 cents and a nail, and the shell of a great-great-great-grandfather's snail. Then he pulls up the pail, makes a most careful count to see if you've paid him the proper amount. Then he hides what you paid him away in his snub, his secret strange hole in his grooveless glove. Then he grunts, I will call you by whisper my phone, for the secrets I tell are for your ears alone. Slop. Down slops the whisper my phone to your ear, and the old Once-ler's whispers are not very clear, since they have to come down through a snurgly hose, and he sounds as if he had smallish beads up his nose. Now I'll tell you, he says, with his teeth sounding gray, how the Lorax got lifted and taken away. It all started way back, such a long, long time back. Way back in the days when the grass was still green, and the pond was still wet, and the clouds were still clean, and the song of the swami swans rang out in space. One morning I came to this glorious place, and I first saw the trees, the tuffula trees, the bright-colored tufts on the tuffula trees, mile after mile in the fresh morning breeze. And under the trees I saw brown barbaloots, frisking about in their barbaloot suits as they played in the shade and ate tuffula fruits. From the ripulous ponds came the comfortable sound of the humming fish humming while splashing around. But those tuffula trees, all my life I've been searching for such trees as these. The touch of their tufts was much softer than silk, and they had that sweet smell of fresh buttery milk. I felt a great leaping of joy in my heart. I knew just what I'd do. I unloaded my cart. In no time at all, I had built a small shop. Then I chopped down a tuffula tree with one chop, and with great skillful skill and with great speedy speed, I took the soft tuft, and I kneaded a thneed. The instant I'd finished, I heard a gazump. I looked. I saw something pop up out of the stump of the tree I had chopped down. It was sort of a man. Describe him? That's hard. I don't know if I can. He was shortish and oldish and brownish and mossy, and he spoke with a voice that was sharpish and bossy. "Mister," he said with his sawdusty sneeze, "I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees have no tongues. And I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs," he was very upset as he shouted and puffed, "what's that thing you have made out of my tuffula tuft?" "Look, Lorax," I said, "there's no cause for alarm. I chopped just one tree. I'm doing no harm. I'm being quite useful. This thing is a thneed. A thneed is a fine something that all people need. It's a shirt, it's a sock, it's a glove, it's a hat. But it has other uses, yes, far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, or curtains, or covers for bicycle seats." The Lorax said, "Sir, you are crazy with greed. There is no one on earth who would buy that fool thneed." But the very next minute, I proved he was wrong. For just at that minute, a chap came along, and he thought that the thneed I had knitted was great. He happily bought it for $3.98. I laughed at the Lorax. "You poor stupid guy. You never can tell what some people will buy." "I repeat," cried the Lorax, "I speak for the trees." "I'm busy," I told him. "Shut up, if you please." I rushed across the room, and in no time at all, I built a radio phone. I put in a quick call. I called all my brothers and uncles and aunts, and I said, "Listen here, here's a wonderful chance for the whole Once-ler family to get mighty rich. Get over here fast. Take the road to North Nitch. Turn left at the Oaxacan, sharp right at South Stitch." And in no time at all, in the factory I built, the whole Once-ler family was working full tilt. We were all knitting thneeds just as busy as bees to the sound of the chopping of tuffula trees. Then, oh baby, oh how my business did grow. Now chopping one tree at a time was too slow, so I quickly invented my super axe hacker, which whacked off 4 tuffula trees in one smacker. We were making thneeds 4 times as fast as before, and the Lorax, he didn't show up anymore. But the next week he knocked on my new office door. He snapped, "I'm the Lorax who speaks for the trees, which you seem to be chopping as fast as you please. But I'm also in charge of the brown barbaloots who played in the shade in their barbaloot suits and happily lived eating tuffula fruits. Now, thanks to your hacking my trees to the ground, there's not enough tuffula fruit to go around, and my poor barbaloots are getting their crummies because they have gas and no food for their tummies." "They love living here, but I can't let them stay. They'll have to find food, and I hope that they may. Good luck, boys," he cried, and he sent them away. I, the Once-ler, felt sad as I watched them all go. But business is business, and business must grow, regardless of crummies and tummies, you know. I meant no harm, I most truly did not, but I had to grow bigger, so bigger I got. I biggered my factory, I biggered my roads, I biggered my wagons, I biggered the loads of the thneeds I shipped out. I was shipping them forth to the south, to the east, to the west, to the north. I went right on biggering, selling more thneeds, and I biggered my money, which everyone needs. Then again he came back. I was fixing some pipes when that old nuisance Lorax came back with more gripes. "I am the Lorax," he coughed and he whiffed. He sneezed and he snuffled, he snarled and sniffed. "Once-ler," he cried with a cruffless croak. "Once-ler, you're making such smogulous smoke. My poor swami swans, why, they can't sing a note. No one can sing who has got smog in his throat." "And so," said the Lorax, "please pardon my cough. They cannot live here, so I'm sending them off. Where will they go? I don't hopefully know. They may have to fly for a month or a year to escape the smog you've smogged up around here. What's more, snapped the Lorax. His dander was up. Let me say a few words about your gluppity-glup. Your machinery chugs on day and night without stop, making gluppity-glup, also sloppity-slop. And what do you do with the leftover goo? I'll show you, you dirty old Once-ler man, you. You're glupping the pond where the humming fish hummed. No more can they hum, for their gills are all gummed. So I'm sending them off. Oh, their future is dreary. They'll walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water that isn't so smeary. And then I got mad. I got terribly mad. I yelled at the Lorax. Now listen here, Dad. All you do is yap, yap, and say, bad, 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 bad. Well, I have my rights, sir, and I'm telling you, I intend to go on just doing what I do. And for your information, you Lorax, I'm figuring on biggerin' and biggerin' and biggerin' and biggerin', turning more tuffula trees into thneeds, which everyone needs. And at that very moment, we heard a loud whack. From outside in the fields came a sickening smack of an axe on a tree. Then we heard the tree fall, the very last tuffula tree of them all. No more trees, no more thneeds, no more work to be done. So, in no time, my uncles and aunts and everyone all waved me goodbye. They jumped into their cars and drove away under the smoke-smuggered stars. Now all that was left beneath this bad-smelling sky was my big, empty factory, the Lorax, and I. The Lorax said nothing, just gave me a glance. Just gave me a very sad, backward glance as he lifted himself by the seat of his pants. And I'll never forget the grim look on his face when he hoisted himself and took leave of this place through a hole in the smog without leaving a trace. And all that the Lorax left here in this mess was a small pile of rocks with one word, unless. Whatever that meant, well, I just couldn't guess. That was long, long ago, but each day since that day, I've sat here and worried away. Through the years, while my buildings have fallen apart, I've worried about it with all of my heart. But now, says the Once-ler, now that you're here, the word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So, catch, calls the Once-ler. He let something fall. It's a tuffula seed. It's the last one of all. You're in charge of the last of the tuffula seeds, and tuffula trees are what everyone needs. Plant a new tuffula. Treat it with care. Give it clean water and feed it fresh air. Grow a forest. Protect it from axes that hack. Then the Lorax and all of his friends may come back. The end. And that's the Lorax. Put your vote below. All right, we're going to jump into the next book, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and the plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. And there's that little hat. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on the top of a mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all of his subjects, first over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, then over the little houses of the townsfolk, to the huts of the farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. Far off in the fields, on the edge of the cranberry bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townsfolks, then to the rich men's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of the town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobbled streets. Clear the way! Clear the way! Make way for the king! All the people rushed for the sidewalks. They drove their carts right up over the curbstones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, on crimson-robed horses, came the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow streets. It swept past Bartholomew. Then, suddenly, its mighty brakes shrieked. It lurched and then stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring back, straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up!" the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guards shouted to their crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. Well, he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. I ought to say something, he thought to himself, but he could think of nothing to say. Well, demanded the king again, do you or do you not take your hat off before the king? Yes, indeed, sire, answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. I do take my hat off before my king. Then take it off this very instant, commanded the king more loudly than before. But, sire, my hat is off, answered Bartholomew. Such impudence, shouted the king, shaking his angry finger. How dare you stand there and tell me that your hat is off? I don't like to say you're wrong, sire, said Bartholomew very politely, but you see, my hat is off. And he showed the king the hat in his hand. If that's your hat in your hand, demanded the king, what's that on your head? My head, gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched a hat. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. It's a hat, sire, he stammered, but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head. I don't care how it got there, said the king. You take it off. And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched the hat off his head. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size, the same color, and it had exactly the same feather. By the crown of my fathers, roared the king, again leaning out of the carriage window. Did I or did I not command you to take off your hat? You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice. Nonsense! There is still a hat upon your head. Another hat? Again, Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched a hat. Come, come, what is the meaning of all this? Demanded the king, his face purple with rage. I don't know, sire, answered Bartholomew. It never happened to me before. The king was now shaking with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. Arrest this impudent trickster, shouted the king to the captain of the king's own guards. We'll teach him to take off his hat. The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace. But the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced all over the cobbled stones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street toward the palace, out of the narrow streets, on up the hill. Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. Flip! The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flip! Flip! Two more flew off. Flip! 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 Flew another, and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of the turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates and into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. His Majesty waits in the throne room, said a guard, saluting the captain. The throne room. The captain dropped Bartholomew to his ground. I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes, he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment, Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw his shoulders back and marched straight ahead into the palace. Follow the black carpet, said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind heavy doors. He won't take off his hat. No, he won't take off his hat. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Lorax, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked at Bartholomew severely. Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king? Your Majesty, said Bartholomew, as politely as he could. I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good. And he took off his hat. And it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat after hat until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. Heavens, said Sir Lorax, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. He's taken off 45, and there were 3 more down in town, said Bartholomew. And you must add on the 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill. 155 hats, most unusual, said Sir Lorax, writing it down on a long scroll. Come, come, said the king impatiently. Sir Lorax, what do you make of this nonsense? Very serious nonsense, your Majesty, answered Sir Lorax. I advise you to call in an expert on hats. Excellent, agreed the king. Ho, guard! Fetch in Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords. Into the room marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. Take a look at this boy's hat, commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of fine hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth of gold, and fine silks and gems and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat I have ever set eyes on. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tippy toes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. Screebies! Screamed Sir Snips, leaping in the air higher than he was tall. Then he turned and ran, shrieking, out of the throne room. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Lorax, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise that you call in your wise men. A fine idea, said the king. Ho, guard, bring me Nod. Nod knows everything, about everything in all my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nod, my wise man, can you take off this hat? Asked the king. Nod shook his head solemnly. Solemnly, no. Then fetch me the father of Nod, commanded the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom and in all the world beyond. In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nod merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. Then bring me the father of Nod, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all the worlds that may happen to be. Then came the oldest man of all of them, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Does this mean that there's no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out to the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. Oh, there's a boy in here, just about your age, the king said. He won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, a very proud-looking little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfrid, nephew of the king. You send him down here, said the Grand Duke Wilfrid. I'll fix him. The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. Well, maybe you can. There's no harm in trying. Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfrid, commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. Pooh! Said the Grand Duke Wilfrid, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. That hat won't come off. You stand over there. He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. When Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfrid had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfrid. And he let an arrow fly. Zoom! It grazed past Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew and over the parapet. But another hat appeared at on his head. Zoom! 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 The arrows flew till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, cried the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped on it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Lorax. These hats are driving me mad, the king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time with the child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch the yeoman of bowmen. Yeoman of the bowmen, echoed all the lords and noblemen of the court. A gigantic man strode out across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew and thicker than his wrist. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Zip, Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore through the air toward Bartholomew Cubbins. Grrz! The sharp arrow head bit through his hat and carried it off, on and on for a full half-mile. Grrz! It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. "It's black magic!" he shrieked. "Black magic! That's just what it is," sighed the king with relief. "I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians." In the whole throne room there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs that led down from the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow, padded feet. The magicians were coming. Low and slow, they were chanting words that were strange. "Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud. Malder, balder, tittle, tud." In came 7 black-crowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. "Stop this useless muttering," ordered the king. "I want a chant that will charm away the boy's hat." The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted. "Winkabus, tinkabus, fiddle-cheek lay, hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howlmen, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, seep away, creep away, leap away, never come back." "A mighty good chant," said the king, looking very pleased. "Are you sure it will work?" All the magicians nodded together. "But," said the king, looking puzzled, "there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work?" "Be calm, O sire, and have no fears," chanted the magicians. "Our charm will work in 10 short years." "10 years!" gasped the king. "Away, fools!" he shouted. "Out of my sight! I can't wait 10 years to get rid of this hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do?" "If I were king," whispered the Grand Duke, "I'd chop off his head." "A dreadful thought," said the king, biting his lips. "But I'm afraid I'll have to." "Young man," he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and he pointed to a small door at the end of the room. "March down those steps to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head." Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded him. "I must take off my hat," he said to himself as he started down the long black stairway. "This is my last chance." One hat after another he tore from his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew he must be in the very heart of the mountain. "Who's there?" said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned a corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly, because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. "The king said you must chop off my head," said Bartholomew. "Oh, I'd hate to," said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. "You seem like such a nice boy." "Well, the king says you have to," said Bartholomew, "so please get it over with." "All right," sighed the executioner, "but first you have to take off your hat." "Why?" asked Bartholomew. "Well, I don't know," said the executioner, "but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone with a hat on." "All right," said Bartholomew. "You take it off for me." The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. "What's this?" he gasped, blinking through the holes in his mask. As another hat sat on Bartholomew's head, he flipped this one off, and then another, and another. "Fiddlesticks!" grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. "I can't execute you at all." And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap at the throne. "What are you doing back here?" he said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," explained Bartholomew. "My head can't come off with the hat on. It's against the rules." "So it can't," said the king, leaning back wearily. "Now how many hats does this make altogether?" "The executioner knocked off 13, and I left 178 more on the dungeon steps," answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Lorax from behind his scroll. "Uncle Derwin," yawned the Grand Duke of Wilfred, "I suppose I'll have to do away with him. Send him up to the highest turrets, and I, in person, will push him off." "Wilfred, I am surprised at you," said the king. "But I guess it's a good idea." So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins toward the highest turret. Up and up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. "This is my very last chance," thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched off another. He pulled and he tore and he flung them behind him. 398. 399. His arms ached from pulling off hats, but still the hats came. Bartholomew climbed on. 448. 449. 450. Counted Bartholomew, puffing up the stairs. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. And then he looked again. The hats had begun to change. Hat 451 had not one, but 2 feathers. Hat 452 had 3. And hat 453 also had 3 and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat just before. Your Majesty, cried out Sir Alaric. But the king and the Grand Duke were way up there where they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. Step right out there and get out on the wall, snapped the Grand Duke. I can't wait to push you off. But when Bartholomew stepped up on the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than any the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilfred took a quick step forward. Bartholomew thought his end had come at last. Wait! Shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. I won't wait, the Grand Duke talked back to the king. I'm going to push him off now. The new big hat makes me madder than ever, and he flung his arms out to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wilfred. He grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. This is to teach you, His Majesty said sternly, that Grand Dukes never talk back to their king. And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfred over his knee and spanked him soundly, right on the seat of his royal silk pants. And now, smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, it would be nice if you would sell me that wonderful hat. 498, 499, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who had just arrived at the top of the steps. And that, he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, makes exactly 500. 500, exclaimed the king. Will you sell it to me for 500 gold pieces? Anything you say, sire, answered Bartholomew. You see, I've never sold one before. The king's hand trembled with joy as he reached out for the hat.